Thank you for joining us, everyone. Welcome back. We can see very clearly that you've been busy online, can't we, Julian? Now, there's lots of great comments. We are going to just quickly delve into a couple of them. First off, what a fantastic opening. Sad not to be able to be there, but that welcome has really communicated the hosting spirit. E mihi ana kia Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei.
Tautoko. Another one here, a great opening address from the Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Jacinda Ardern, calling for unity, partnership and progress. Te kotahitanga, te whakawhanaungatanga me te whakawhanaketanga.
Tika, another comment. Fonterra CEO Miles Hurrell summed up the two challenges for us all really well. One, how we drive a sustainable and inclusive recovery from COVID-19, and two, how we transition to a low-carbon future. As he says, business has a vital role to play.
That's right, and we've also just heard from President Xi as well. A comment here, the call from President Xi for developed economies to act, quote, with a sense of being in a shared community to embark on a path of sustainable development is another great starting point for the CEO Summit, the APEC CEO Summit 2021, and echoes the opening call from Jacinda Ardern.
And just one last comment to add, in addition to that, it is an agreement with President Xi that innovation will be important not only for economic development but also for creating a green, sustainable economy for the good of the planet.
Yeah, thank you very much for your comments. It's great to see them coming in and the feedback as well. So please continue to do that. The first topic for today's summit is the economic state of the world. Our first keynote interview is coming up next, which will traverse the current state of the world and the implications for the Asia-Pacific region as it emerges from the pandemic. After a short video from PwC, we welcome Bob Moritz, Global Chairman of PwC, in conversation with the wonderful Seema Mody, CNBC Global Markets reporter and host of Trading Nation.
Bob Moritz, Global Chairman of PwC. It's a pleasure to see you today.
Nice to see you, Seema, as well. And thanks for having us. It's a pleasure for PwC to be helping with the hosting of this very important conference.
Absolutely. And I would love to just start this conversation with you, taking a step back and you look at, if we were having a conversation a year and a half ago, the incredible recovery that we have seen in the global economic story. Of course, it's been uneven and there are now some serious concerns about inflation, supply chain, but I'm curious from where you stand and the conversations you're having with individuals in the C-suite, how are they characterizing the state of the global economy with less than 2 months left in the year?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the business community, as we think about their views, would see a singularity in a measurement being GDP, which is a great storyline. Many are predicting GDP growth of in excess of 6%, which is a great story, both in its absolute terms when looking backwards, but also compared to where we were a year or 2 years ago. But the reality is, Seema, that GDP growth has a tremendous amount of uncertainty within it. There's three primary factors that people are concerned about: rising interest rates, coupled with an increasing debt load, both at the government level, corporate level, and consumer level. And last but not least, asset prices that are extremely high right now with a tremendous amount of fragility within them. Now, I start there because, unfortunately, the world today focuses too much on the bottom line, be it net income or from a country perspective, GDP. And you also have to look at the state of the play around the ESG world, which was mentioned in the earlier comments. And here we have a mixed bag. Do we have the environmental progress that's necessary to survive relevant to the planet and the challenges we see? Do we actually have enough inclusion relevant to the growth? That economic prosperity is going to more and more people, and are we actually doing that in a very inclusive way? And last but not least, are we minimizing the risk of bad behavior through good governance? And here I think many CEOs would say there's definitely room for improvement. And there's a good news story here. The business community has probably never been more engaged, at least in my tenure, in my role, in terms of these issues and having a positive impact as they look ahead.
So you highlight, from what I can gather, some of the positives and negatives, areas and room for improvement, but at the same time, acknowledging that when you look at asset prices, at least the U.S. stock market, which is trading in record high territory, I'm wondering, where are you seeing the business opportunities when you speak to clients, new ones and old ones?
Yeah, so first at a macro level, globally, the business opportunities for the corporates that are existing today are the ones that move the fastest, with speed and agility, and can change and bring the scale of that change to the table. How you interact with your customers in new and different ways post-COVID, how you manage your supply chain, which we've talked about already and has been mentioned several times. That need for speed is a great opportunity from distancing yourself from the really great organizations that will do extremely well and see tremendous upside versus those that are perhaps latent with some of the historical problems and have not changed. But let's go to the region. The region has a tremendous amount of potential. Here's the upside. Number one, the Prime Minister talked about earlier in her speech, the need for regional cooperation. The underlying megatrends in the region are tremendous. When you look at the demographics, the rise of the middle class, and the consumer spend that's going to be needed, particularly over the next decade or two. If the region can come together more so, that's a huge upside potential, not only within the region, but actually the region for the benefit of the world. The second thing I would focus on, this region has a tremendous opportunity in terms of the workers that they have and the skilled labor, the ability to apply and bring digital technology to the equation, and to do it in a way that brings ESG to the agenda. What I'm going to comment on is these things are intertwined. They can't be talked about in silos. They have to be intertwined. And last but not least, if you go to that intertwined comment, the region has an opportunity to help the world with supply chain matters in a way that is eco-friendly, ESG-friendly. And if so, the world will come to it more so as we think about trade, investment, and where we actually go in terms of the trade agreements that the world is looking for, because the world is in need for that clean energy, that cleaner supply chain, that socially friendly agenda. And that's where this part of the world, I think, has a lot of opportunity and upside potential.
Yeah, demographics, rising middle class, these are trends we talk about a lot on CNBC, and of course myself as a global markets reporter. But as you point out, coordination is also a key to success. So I'm curious what you see as some of the big challenges. Of course, U.S.-China relations remain front and center. How could that cloud your outlook or the areas you see opportunity?
Yeah, so you've got a couple of clouds that are out there. As you said, the uncertainty out of China, both from a trade perspective, but also what China is doing domestically. And that uncertainty has ramifications on a worldwide basis. So understanding that better and having some certainty to it allows people to react and plan accordingly. The second piece, which is a worldwide phenomenon that is hitting this region as well, is in fact the labor challenge that we see today. If we don't have the labor necessary to move the logistics and deal with logistics support, supply chain gets impacted, consumption gets impacted, the lack of growth ultimately happens. And that is a worldwide phenomenon that's particularly acute when you look at the supply chain dominance that resides within that part of the world. The other part I want to make, which is a half full comment, though, is the reality is there is a lot of politicizing of the supply chains, meaning we need to bring them to the home country. The evidence we see in talking to the business community is that's not the case. We actually don't see a lot of inbound on a solo basis. In fact, what we are seeing is diversification That's not a surprise when you look at the lessons learned out of COVID. So that's an upside potential if we can avoid reacting to the media headlines and the politicizing of the bring it all home. That's an opportunity, again, for the region as we think about the interregional trade agreements and some of the investments that are necessary. Last point I would say is that we need to have better infrastructure across the board that is fit for the future. That goes to the fundamental foundations and historical definitions of infrastructure, but I am going to go to the labor force. Is the labor force future-proof, meaning it is really set for the future and actually able to equip? And that's where there's a big challenge with government and business working together more so to actually solve for that problem as a big, big red flag that I think we have to be focused on over the next couple of years.
I mean, it seems to me from what you're saying, if you look at the labor shortage coinciding with the supply chain issues, I imagine this underscores more clients of yours to double down on autonomous technology, artificial intelligence. Are you seeing that happen right now? What are some of the solutions companies are coming to you with, or that PwC is providing clients right now, given these issues don't seem to be going away in the short term?
The reality is technology is a huge upside potential for organizations, and was said, I think, in some of the introductory comments, technology with humanity and humane technology is super important to how do we actually do this in a much more inclusive way. The reality is many organizations are not focusing on one technology or another, but rather bringing the combination of technologies together. When you look at sensor technology, GPS technologies, AI, the ability to bring massive amounts of data together, analyze that and adjust accordingly and change work processes. That's fantastic for organizations. But let's remind ourselves that the use of technology is all about innovation. How do I actually drive change through the use of technology and through the combination of technology with the workforce I have today and the workforce of tomorrow? Through that, you can change work process. In getting better work process, you can get more effective and efficient, and then redeploy that human capital into other opportunities and do it in a much more inclusive way if we're bringing people in to that equation. So I think the idea here is, how do you actually access data? How do you enhance the skills that your labor force has? How do you take advantage of the combination of technologies that exist and then apply it for all problems you're trying to solve for? And that could be supply chain, customer experience, and yes, the combination of all that with ESG in mind.
Another point I wanted to follow up on was the diversification of a company's manufacturing footprint. It's something that I know a lot of executives are reviewing and assessing. What's the next big market we should be going to? And I'm curious if you have an answer to that. We saw the issues that were front and center in Vietnam. Are there other countries that are stepping up and saying, you know what, manufacture here, we've got better prices and we've got good quality of labor and talent?
Look, you see many different countries in the region, particularly Asia-Pac region right now, that actually is creating that opportunity. They're bringing the right infrastructure, they're bringing the right incentives, they have the quality of the labor workforce, and they have the infrastructure necessary to make this happen. Vietnam's a great example of that. Others are following suit. The question is, can they do so with speed? Because the competition for supply chain alternatives is on as we speak. These organizations are making the tough decisions when looking at not only what exists today, but what they believe will exist over the next 3, 5, and 10 years. And organizations at the corporate level with their governance bodies are making some choices to diversify. The lesson learned in COVID was to not go to singularity and not to have what I'll call critical dependency risks. And it's not only the supply chain, but the enablement of that supply chain that organizations have to think about. Here's where the community leaders actually can do much more to think systemically around, how do I create a supply chain that is eco-friendly? How do I create a supply chain that is socially friendly? How do I create a supply chain that is safe, secure, robust, and actually can be scaled as necessary and can go up and down very quickly and react with speed, certainty, and resiliency? Those are the things corporates want to hear in order for them to invest. That's where I think a lot of the opportunities exist, and hopefully the business community, coupled with the government officials and policy setters, can actually set the standards for what they are doing today and planning for tomorrow.
What do you think are some of the holdups? Because it makes sense, and this is a discussion we have at the Council on Foreign Relations, where I'm heavily involved in, about the need for public and private sector working together and more effectively. What do you think is stopping both sides from doing so, or are there ways to improve that relationship, especially as we look and dissect some of the trade agreements between countries in the APEC region and with the United States?
So you have three big phenomenons that you have to look at as go to the root cause issue of what's slowing things down. And that goes to infrastructure support, exclusive of ESG, but also ESG projects that'll be beneficial for the climate and the planet on an overall basis. The first is, do we have the capital? And can we get the combination of private money coupled with a little bit of seed or catalytic growth from the public companies coming from the development banks and the like to actually bring this to life? The good news here is that over the last 2 weeks leading up to COP26, you had the financial services industry commit to a significant amount of capital to go into that, to make the progress that's necessary to make the changes for the world. The second problem, though, is project sponsors need to be better prepared for the business case, the ROI, and the connection to the sustainable results they're looking to achieve. It's interesting, for the first time ever, the profession came together, the accounting firms, the consulting firms came together to actually try to come up with diagnostics and tools to help project sponsors do a better job being ready for that diligence. So we slow down the time from investment to match opportunity. And last but not least is we're not learning the lessons around the world. How do we get SWAT teams that have learned the lessons from one project to another to actually speed things up, not only in terms of applying that capital, but actually committing the capital, executing with the capital, and then scaling up the benefits for society to be benefiting from. And those three things are some of the key root cause issues. And we've put some proposals in place with governments and private. Now we're trying to work together to try to drive this to a better conclusion, hopefully make a better outcome as we look at the societal needs that exist today.
Wow, when I hear you say this, I think all these, the public and private sector, they should be coming to you. Maybe you can be the liaison. But with that comes just this conversation, which we've certainly had at the APEC CEO Summit around the need for technology. And it's not just trade, it's digital trade. And I'm curious not only what digital trade means to you going into a new year, but your thoughts and reflection on the use of technologies over the past year and a half. Of course, certain technologies have become bigger beneficiaries due to COVID.
Yeah, so the technology game has been accelerated probably by a decade in terms of the opportunities. Said differently, corporates, and I'm going to argue governments, were slow in the adoption of technology that actually could better the world that we are living in today. COVID forced them to move fast and take away any of the internal hurdles that got in the way of moving forward with that kind of speed. There was a lot of lessons learned in this regard. The three lessons learned come back to a couple of points. Number one, how do you think about not the technology, but the change you're trying to drive? Second, how do you actually get your workforce, the citizens of the countries we're talking to be participatory in that change, not necessarily be those that are actually resulting from the change. They got to participate in driving that change. And in order to do that, it gets to the third point, which is, do they have the skill sets are necessary for the future? Here, I truly believe, we PwC and the studies we've done truly believe government cannot do this by themselves. And in fact, the corporates working with governance have to do much more as we think about the educational process for employees today that worry about their jobs tomorrow, future employees that are coming, and equally as important, the youth of the world to participate in this change. All three of those things have to be addressed as we think about skilling, upskilling, and the transformation of skills necessary to participate in this change in a much more inclusive way. So big lesson learned because of the change. Last point I want to make. Over history, we've gone through 3, 4, 5 systematic seismic shifts in terms of how talent is used and managed. You can go back to Industrial Revolution, you can go to the plague. I truly believe this is going to be one of those times. We've got a lot of experimenting to do. If anybody's thinking about the labor force and different ways to attack that opportunity, I'm going to argue they're wrong. We're going to have to experiment for a period of time before we come out of this with a new norm. But let's remind ourselves to reflect on the past. Let's reflect then after on what we learned during COVID, but let's apply it to create that new world. And it really comes back to the S in the ESG agenda. Are we doing what's necessary to actually serve society so the individuals and the collective groups and the communities that are underprivileged and underserved can actually participate in a way that we haven't done in the last 10 or 20 years?
Yeah, it's a great point. When a crisis hits, that often makes room for innovation. And now, as you say, as we build back better with ESG components, that could really lead to us achieving as a world some of the big goals that we have around the environment. What about the digital divide, Bob? This is a common theme that comes up on CNBC, I know, at this summit. What does it mean for stakeholders across the region?
Yeah, it's clear that coming out of COVID and well before COVID, we were already moving towards this digital divide. And you saw it from the underserved countries in terms of some of the communities that did not have access to education and technology. You now see it even more so in terms of the gender issue, with women actually, unfortunately, not participating in the upside potential that's out there and not being in the game relevant to labor force, no cause of their own by all means. The reality is more needs to be done by government to actually figure out ways to connect with those groups, give them good quality content in terms of educational opportunities, make sure that there's enough entrepreneurship and innovation to create jobs for the supply that hopefully we're creating. And last but not least, let's get the youth more engaged in the change. They are smart. They are equipped to help. They can actually not only benefit from the change, but actually they can help drive the change. And especially when you look at some of the parts of the world that we're talking to today, I think there's a lot more opportunity for the youth to be part of the equation. I'm part of this organization called Generation Unlimited, which is an offshoot of UNICEF, and we focus on those four things. The idea is to get to hundreds of millions of people at the youth level, and then figure out those learnings and apply them and scale them in a big, consistent way across the globe, because the entire world, no matter if it's developed or undeveloped, needs this kind of focus going forward. And as you know, Seema, it's a crowded agenda right now. So we have to bring this higher on the agenda looking forward for our policymakers, our business leaders, as well as our government leaders.
And would you say in conversation with companies, large ones, multinationals across the world, they're more receptive to the sustainability programs, and there's a better sort of correlation with the impact it can have on profits, saying, it's not just a good thing for the world, but it actually has a return on investment?
Absolutely. I've never seen the business community more engaged. And you see that engagement in a couple of ways. You see it both in terms of what they're doing differently and some of the commitments they're making. You see it in terms of sectors coming together to say, what policy changes do we need to give our politicians the confidence to make those kind of changes and to help enable the system to be a different system than what we've had before? And last but not least, they are putting out the information to hold them accountable. And we see systematic change. There's got to be more, don't get me wrong. And that goes to governance and the responsibilities of boards. How do we incent the right behavior in our compensation plans? How do we measure appropriately to demonstrate progress and comparability? We're going to see a lot of change in that regard that goes to the corporates. And I think we got to get equal focus on the governments as well to bring these collective two groups together to try to make that progress. But the good news is everybody's leaning into the opportunity, and they see that doing good is equally as important to the bottom line, to the investors, as much as it is to the broader stakeholder community that they now need to serve even more so.
Wanted to inject India into the conversation and your thoughts on the role the Indians have been playing when it comes to ESG. There's been some criticism that they haven't been as receptive as other countries, and what you're hearing on the there.
Yeah, so first, as we look at India, India continues to be a big opportunity that, as we survey clients around the world, when we say, what are the top 5 or 10 countries you want to invest in other than your home country, India continues to rise in that regard. Having said that, India has somewhat underperformed relevant to the needs for change to drive that to be much more acceptable as it is today. ESG is another opportunity for them. You saw Prime Minister Modi actually go with the commitment for 2070. Some will argue that's not fast enough. But again, we've got to make progress and move forward as quickly as we can, irrespective of the goal that he committed. And this is where the business community, just like in other countries, the business community drove more so faster than perhaps the politicians made the decisions they did on those commitments. Likewise, though, India also has to focus on the S side of the equation. As we think about the opportunities for more inclusive growth, India's got a great opportunity to be another alternative for supply chain as you look at the US, China, et cetera. And that's where the world would be looking for those alternatives. This is an opportunity for India to step up in a big time way as we look ahead.
Yeah, lastly, are we emerging from the pandemic? Are we at a state where we are managing the pandemic, especially now with more therapeutics hitting the market, more people getting vaccinated? I just want to get your take on where we are post-COVID.
Yeah, look, the reality is Well, the reality is we know it's a challenge. It still is a challenge, but we are seeing that light at the end of the tunnel through the combination of vaccinations, the controls that various countries have put in place, and you see it in the lessening of the restrictions that go forward. You also are seeing it, though, in terms of the labor force coming back, the consumption coming back, and travel, leisure, and other aspects coming back in a big-time way. So the trajectory is really positive. Coming back to the opening comment and question you asked in terms of where that growth is going to be, let's make sure it's focused in the right way. And it's actually a changed definition of growth in a much more inclusive, ESG-friendly way. And that's what I think we've got to focus on going forward.
I was just at JFK last night. Let me tell you, travel is back. Bob, it's a pleasure to speak with you today. Bob Moritz, Global Chairman of PwC.
Thanks, Seema.
What a wonderful, fascinating discussion there. Bob Moritz, the Global Chair of PwC, with the interview with CNBC's Global Markets reporter, Seema Mody. I'm Henry Kiaukura. We are about to continue the discussion on the economic state of the world with a panel of speakers joining us from across the APEC region. But just before we do that, let's set the scene with a short address from the OECD's Secretary General, Mathias. Please welcome Mathias.
Thank you for your warm introduction. The global economy has been recovering faster and more strongly than we anticipated even a year ago. Extensive policy support combined with the comparatively rapid development and then deployment of effective vaccines, along with the accelerating digital transformation of our economies, all contributed to this more optimistic outlook. In our recent interim economic outlook, we project global GDP to grow 5.7% this year and 4.5% next year. Yet, the recovery remains uneven across countries and sectors, and uncertainty and significant downside risks remain, including the possible emergence of new COVID variants because of uneven vaccination levels, as well as inflationary pressures. To optimize the strength and the quality of the recovery, we need to continue working to stay on top of the public health challenge. First and foremost, that means continued efforts to get as many people as possible all around the world vaccinated as quickly as possible. Policy support should remain flexible, adjusting to the evolving health and economic situation and better targeted to those in genuine need of continued support and towards future-focused investment, particularly into our green and digital transitions. Open markets, a strong competitive framework, a system which rewards the most productive and innovative business ideas and encourages investment in future growth will lead to quality job creation and the lifting of living standards. And because trade has been and should remain a central engine for the recovery, all the trading nations around the world have an interest in strengthening the rules-based multilateral trading system with the World Trade Organization at its center. Finally, and importantly, recovery policies must promote equality of opportunities and foster social mobility, including by restoring and boosting opportunities for women and young people. While deploying our recovery efforts, we also need to continue to address crucial pre-existing structural challenges. We need to get to global net zero emissions by 2050. The OECD will help drive and support more ambitious, effective and globally coordinated action on climate change through better data and comparative policy effort and impact. Finally, we must seize the opportunities while better managing the risks associated with the accelerating digital transformation of our economies. Just last month, 136 countries and jurisdictions, members of the OECD G20 Inclusive Framework on BEPS, have reached a historical agreement which will make our international tax system fairer and work better, and make it fit for purpose in our digitalized economy. It will reallocate more than $125 billion US of profit to countries worldwide, and we will see countries collect around $150 billion US more in new tax revenues annually. The OECD will continue to work with global fora to address the economic challenges of our times. We look forward to further intensifying our partnership with APEC and your member economies in order to make the recovery stronger, resilient and homogeneous across the region and beyond. Thank you.
Some very insightful comments there from Mathias. Of course, to continue this discussion, it is my pleasure to introduce the moderator for this next discussion on the economic state of the world, Dr. Alan Bollard, an economic leader both here in Aotearoa, New Zealand and internationally.
Hi, Alan is the Professor of Pacific Region Business at Victoria University of Wellington, Te Tumu Herengawaka, and inaugural Chair for Pacific Region Business. Previously, Alan was Executive Director of the APEC Secretariat based in Singapore and Governor of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, where he was responsible for monetary policy and bank regulations, helping steer Aotearoa, New Zealand through the global financial crisis. Alan will be coming to us live from Te Whangaruiatara, our Wellington studio, in Aotearoa, New Zealand's capital city. Please welcome Dr. Alan Bollard and his panel. Alan Bollard and his panel.
Well, good morning, good day, good evening, good night, wherever you are around the APEC region. We're here with a panel today to talk to you, continue the story about the state of the world, but talk to you about economic recovery and trade in APEC. And I'm going to moderate the discussion today. It's a confusing period. We know we're in economic recovery, but COVID has hit APEC very hard. The Asia Pacific trade analysis just put out yesterday says that we've lost something like over $1 trillion in income over this period. And compared to the global financial crisis, the COVID downturn has been faster and deeper, although possibly shorter. But we're still trying to struggle to understand this recovery. It's full of contradictions. We're just recording very strong record, in fact, growth of 10% over the last quarter, but then only a year ago it was negative 5%, a record contraction. Trade seems to have been increasing rapidly on the merchandise side, but services trade is quite worryingly negative at the moment. Investment, domestic investment's been increasing. Foreign direct investment actually is at 20-year lows right now. Costs are pushing up, but central banks are saying it's not inflation. Wages are going up, but productivity is stagnant. Jobs are being displaced, but skill shortages are being reported everywhere. And when we look at what government's doing about it all, there's just been huge fiscal and monetary policy stimulus. So far, little debt stress or bank stress, but we don't know how long that continue on. Well, to help unravel all of this, we've got a top international panel to think about how to understand this quite complicated recovery. I'm going to just give their backgrounds very quickly. They've all got very impressive CVs, but to save time, let me quickly introduce Mary Huen, who is Chief Executive of Standard Chartered Bank in Hong Kong. Welcome, Mary. Good afternoon to you. Jan De Silva, who's President and CEO of Toronto Region Board of Trade. And welcome to you. And John Denton, who's Secretary General of the International Chamber of Commerce in Paris. Our panel is going to talk about trade challenges, digital opportunities, global governance, and then we'll have something of a conversation about how to improve the recovery. Mary, let me cut straight to you and your views on current challenges in trade.
Thank you. Thank you, Alan. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. So it's not a surprise that we're facing challenges in trade, right? So of course, geopolitical risks and economic uncertainty has been affecting international trade. We all know about that. The second one, outbreak of our COVID, has caused international trade decline by 9.2% in 2020. So we are seeing that level of decline. And of course, one of the major drags was the international lockdown to contain the spread of virus. The third challenge is market distortions. We're seeing demand coming back, hitting the market, but the supply is not catching up, right? So it's a supply chain distortion. So what exactly are the current challenges facing the clients? I've been talking to many clients in this part of the region. Every time I talk to them, if I can summarize, there are always three highs that are around the challenges they're talking about. First is the high price of raw materials. We all know aluminum price climbed nearly 50% so far this year. Second high is the high price of labor. People are competing resources to meet the supply and supply chain demand. And the third high is the price of logistics. The price of the containers has just skyrocketed and can be more than 10 times higher than it was 2 years ago. So it all have distorting effect on the way businesses are running. So typically when we got our medical report, we don't like the three highs, right? So this time the three highs are the raw materials, the labor costs, as well as the logistics. So I think what is coming that I'm seeing can be potentially encouraging is RCEP, potentially an encouraging outlier to the growing trend of protectionism and deglobalization. So it will enter into force in January of the 1st, 2022. And I think financial institutions like us, we are one of them, who have different footprint in Asia, Middle East, and different parts of the world, have a role to play in supporting the funding, supporting the ambition of the manufacturers, of the companies to transform, either going digital, going partnership, and to provide financial services to help them access funding better. So we think we are looking forward to RCEP, looking forward to, of course, the post-COVID scenario, but we are all well positioned to support companies given our footprint and working together with APEC. I'll pause here. Ellen, back to you.
Thanks very much, Mary. Jan, digital readiness to cope with this recovery?
Thanks, Alan. Look, in my opinion, the recovery will be digitally enabled. While all economies were impacted by the pandemic, those with digital readiness endured and rebounded better. Jurisdictions with the physical and digital infrastructure were faster at deploying digital COVID tools like contact tracing, proof of vaccination, and digital trade facilitation, which enabled them to minimize general lockdowns and keep their economies more fully open. Businesses that were digitally mature were able to pivot to remote work and effectively participate in the mass global migration to e-commerce. The conditions of COVID acted as an accelerant. 5 years worth of tech adoption happened in the first 8 weeks of the pandemic. Some sped up efforts already underway, while others implemented digital capabilities for the very first time, simply as a matter of survival. Looking to the future, digital readiness will be even more important. I chair ABAC's Digital Working Group. Our 2022 priority is tackling the physical and digital infrastructure necessary for APEC members to harness the benefits of the digital economy. Elements like inclusive broadband and 5G, digital ID, fintech, data governance, and cybersecurity. These require innovation-friendly government regulations and interoperable cross-border solutions. A key consideration for our work is the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement initiated by Chile, New Zealand, and Singapore. It strives to address a range of digital economy issues like AI, digital ID, and digital inclusion, all with the goal to enable digital trade. And coming through COVID, DIPA, this agreement, is attracting growing participation interest from other jurisdictions. What the pandemic taught us is that when the right digital foundations are in place, many challenges are addressed. More people and micro and small and medium-sized enterprises get to participate in the economy. Businesses scale more easily. Innovators can bring quick solutions to market. And most importantly, on a digital basis, solutions can be mobilized rapidly across economies. For all these reasons, I see digital readiness being key to unlocking recovery post-COVID. And with that, I'll pause. Thanks, Alan.
Thanks very much, Jan. John, you've been around a number of big global meetings recently. Is global governance working for us in this recovery?
Well, thanks very much, Alan. It's great to be with you. You made some very telling comments in your opening address about the power of and the devastation of the COVID-19 crisis economically, particularly what you saw in the APEC region. One observation I make is that the black swan here was not the existence of the pandemic. In fact, I sit on a number of infrastructure boards. If you look at the asset risk management plans, they all actually have generally a piece in there about dealing with pandemic. So that's not that's not actually the black swan. The black swan was the failure of global cooperation, and it continues. And one reason global cooperation failed was it has not been supported effectively by global economic governance. The whole point of global economic governance is actually to help us manage global risks, but also to create global public goods, neither of which have been in a lot of evidence in the last period, particularly in the COVID period. And if you think about the roll call, and I've been involved with all of them in the last month or so, so the G20 can no longer provide the economic stewardship it provided in the wake of the global financial crisis. Look at the splits and the tensions within. Look at the softness of the wording that comes out of any of their announcements. Think about what the pandemic exposed in terms of global health governance and the response by governments. By and large, this was to throw up their arms, blow up the drawbridges and avoid cooperating to the degree required by the situation. I mean, I sit on the COVAX Council, which actually oversees equitable distribution of vaccines. It's been a lot promised by global governments that they would actually support that. It's not happening at the level required. Again, an institution which was set up to enable has actually been disabled by the failure of cooperation. I've just come out of COP26 in Glasgow. I think some of the people on the call today would have heard Prime Minister Johnson redefine success as we move towards the last couple of days. That's because what was seen as the aspiration of bringing together all leaders in person, in many respects, in Glasgow, has failed to deliver. Pledges to reduce carbon emissions for decades in the future based on technologies that do not yet exist, they're not going to really solve what is an existential threat. And by the way, as you know, COVID and climate change are problems that don't have passports. So these are global issues. And of course, the primary body for writing and adjudicating trade rules, the WTO, is in a constitutional crisis. Frankly, it's in a legitimacy crisis. All three elements of its operating model, its oversight, negotiations and dispute settlement limbs have all broken down, and which, if not solved, will lead the organisation to drift further into irrelevance. In fact, it was missing all the way through COVID until Dr. Ngozi came on board, and thank God she's there. But it's not on her shoulders alone to fix this mess. And so at precisely the moment when global cooperation is most needed to meet a range of cascading interconnected threats, the pandemic, runaway climate change, deepening inequalities and economic insecurity, just a couple of examples, most governments are distracted, preoccupied with attending to domestic challenges. And all this matters to business. I used to be part of the APEC Business Advisory Council, like Jan. I chaired finance and economics there for years. The problem for business is the inability to write global trade deals means fragmented legal regimes, greater administrative costs and inefficiencies, fewer market access opportunities, and trade rules written before the internet was even invented, which is exactly the issue that Jan's dealing with, which is the failure of global governance to keep up with the digital economy. And the inability of governments to deal with common challenges effectively means outcomes like a prolonged pandemic, and that's what we're seeing now. We're in the fourth wave, worsening climate change and deeper economic downturns than are actually necessary. None of these are good for business. So at the ICC, we've got a close view of all these issues. We are the only business group which has now got UN observer status, which is very recent. They finally thought that the business community might be able to help in terms of resolving some of these global issues. We're now the principal business interlocutor with the WTO and the industry focal group around COP26. But what I see in my engagement with these organisations is that many of their problems often come down to a lack of meaningful business engagement. One of the defining features of APEC has been the horizontal alignment of actually a business advisory council with leaders. It's actually bringing the business people right into the leadership level. This does not happen effectively elsewhere. We're missing that at the WTO, and we're actually in the process of discussing this with Dr. Ngozi now so that we can actually bring the end users into the decision-making process. The G20 and the B20 have actually been split into parallel paths. They need to be joined up again, and I'm talking to Indonesia about how we can do that. They're now two separate. And frankly, when I go to COP, the wrong people are in the room. If business people were in the room and actually had a problem-solving approach rather than a point-scoring approach, we might actually be able to get and hammer out some solutions. So the key thought to leave with you here is that our global governance systems are just not up to scratch at the moment. I'm sorry, but there are ways of improving them, including through business raising its voice in favour of reform, but also getting much more involved in the actual process itself. A multi-stakeholder approach is actually what's required for multilateralism and for global governance in the 21st century.
Well, thanks, John. I hope some of those comments are being recorded by officials and going into leaders when they meet tomorrow, and we'll see what sort of statement and commitment they've got and all of that. In the past, when APEC region has relied very heavily on trade driving growth and pulling us out of these problems and spreading growth and improving livelihoods around the region, can we rely on trade driven growth to get us out of this one this time? Jan, do you want to think about that one for us?
I would say absolutely. And I think it comes down to some critical points that Mary was making about the challenges right now in logistics and supply chain movement. We've got a chronic shortage of goods in North America, lots of pent-up demand. We've got to get those containers over here and through the ports and on our roads and rail to get things distributed. So absolutely, we see demand for trade continuing to increase. And as I was touching on, trade not just in physical goods, but also digital economy type services. So lots of room for growth, in our opinion.
Thanks, Mary. You're right in the middle of trade hub in Hong Kong, and of course a lot of SMEs there as well. Are you reasonably optimistic about a trade-driven growth story this time around?
Yeah, I think when we talk about trade, we cannot forget about SMEs, right? They comprise, in Asia Pacific, they comprise 98% of the enterprises and 50% of the workforce. I think there are a few areas, particularly post-COVID, we have to help the SME. Of course, digital is one area which Jan talked about. I think trade is very digital enabled. We actually need to help them in getting the right innovation technology to transform their model. We did a survey here, and when we asked the SMEs, 84% of the surveyed SME wish the government to support them for the digital technology deployment. So I think how can we bring together these needs and get together to work with the regulators as well as the financial sector is one of them. Second is the access to financing, which from the financial industry, we definitely need to help them because they are less likely the one to obtain the bank loans from time to time. So now we can use alternate data. Again, this is digital enabled. We can use alternate data. We can use commercial data center and digital currency in the future to reduce their settlement risk as well as the liquidity risk.
Thanks, Mary. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut in. We're just right at the end, and I think there's another world leader waiting to talk. Thank you all very much for your comments on this. I hope we can be optimistic in this going forward, and we will watch how this recovery takes place. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. Good to meet you.
When Jan De Silva and John Denton there, who joined Alan with a fascinating panel. Boy, you know, the Black Caps won this morning, and one of the panellists, John Denton, had a bit of a run up there.
Well, it's good to hear.
With a bit of a fast pitch,
yeah. I mean, the great thing about APEC is that we know there are all sorts of amazing minds, amazing leaders joining us digitally from around the APEC economies and from around the world this morning. So it is a great opportunity for everyone who is speaking here, if you have something to say it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the main points that he mentioned, which will get picked up, I think, Alan asked whether or not people are going to pick up on these comments tomorrow, particularly the APEC leaders, and I think they will. One of the comments, obviously, around the lack of collaboration, the lack of governments to work together. That was one of the big issues that has come out of the pandemic so far. And of course, Jan had mentioned that one of the big issues also was the challenges of, supply chains, of not taking on digital economies and looking at building that up further, which is, I think, something else that will get picked up. And high prices, raw materials, high price of labour, high price of logistics, we mentioned in those as well.
I think a lot of there has been a sense that multilateral institutions and international organisations have been undermined significantly in the last 18 months to 2 years, and this is a great opportunity for leaders within those APEC economies to address some of those concerns and actually look at tangible steps that will make for a more sustainable recovery off the back of this pandemic. Please do send through your comments. We have had so many on our interactive platform this morning, and this is the great thing about doing a digital summit this year. We can actually share some of your comments. A lot of interest in Bob Moritz's comments before, especially regarding ESG. Bob's comment that ESG and business are intertwined couldn't be more true. It's great to see this is so high up on the agenda this year. This is a trend that isn't going away.
Yeah, absolutely. Another one here from Christopher Roberts, who asks, will part of the answer to the supply chain challenge and avoiding single point vulnerabilities be to, quote, go local, to have your suppliers and possibly your customers close to home?
Please do make sure you send through your comments. We want the summit to be as interactive as possible. It is one of the benefits of being at a virtual summit. Coming up next, we're going to hear from the Prime Minister of Australia. We will share some inspiring business stories from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and a little flavour of Auckland. We're going to hear from the Mayor of Auckland, Phil Goff, and we will have an address from the President of Peru. But before that, alongside all of the world leaders who will be joining us for the APEC 2021 CEO Summit, we have a message from a very special friend of New Zealand, Mr. Stephen Colbert.
Kia ora. I'm Stephen Colbert, and I'm here to thank you all on behalf of New Zealand for attending the APEC CEO Summit 2021, which I always tell everyone is in my top 10 CEO summits. As you may know, I'm a big fan of this beautiful country at the bottom of the Pacific, which is so much more than just the place where Peter Jackson filmed the Lord of the Rings movies. It's also where Peter Jackson filmed the Hobbit movies. I've visited New Zealand a number of times, and as an honorary Kiwi myself, I want to welcome you all by using the traditional New Zealand dialect. But don't worry, we're going to put up subtitles so the rest of you can follow along. I was stoked when Jacinda, the head Sheila, called me on the blower. I thought, sweet as, that would be pretty choice. And then next minute, here I am. So I want to thank all you punters, good as gold. I want to thank the ref and the ball boys. Thanks to the team in the kitchen for the feed. Let's have a good summit, a fair summit. Both teams play well, and really business will be the winner on the day. See you in Thailand. Cheer. Told you it would be a piece of
Nailed it. I think we may have lost half the international audience there who didn't understand a word of that, but Jack and I very much got it.
We swear it's English. We swear it's English. It mightn't have sounded like English, but it hurts because it's so true.
No, it is actually. I was sitting there going, I understood every single word. There is one phrase in particular he uses, which is chur. Again, doesn't make much sense to many others who'll be watching and listening here today. But for us, it actually means awesome, or, you know, it can actually be used in a multiple varying ways, which is one that we use in New Zealand a lot. So, chur, Stephen, choice.
Chur, Stephen. Last I checked, chur is still not acceptable in the international Scrabble laws, but that might need a little update after the 2021 APEC CEO Summit. No, it is great that we are able to share so many different perspectives throughout the 2021 APEC right. CEO Summit. You not only are we hearing from Stephen Colbert today, a little later on in the day one session, we will be hearing from international human rights lawyer Amal Clooney. I'm reasonably confident she's going to be giving a different style of address to
I suspect
Stephen
a little bit
Colbert.
more, yeah, and influential for the APEC region. We hope so, certainly, yeah.
Slightly more measured?
Yeah, a little bit more highbrow, I suspect.
No. It is great to have someone like Stephen Colbert, someone of his stature tuning in. He swears, apparently off camera, that he isn't going to be missing a minute of the sessions over the next couple of days, which, you know, we wouldn't expect anything less from a man of his intellect and
That's
mana.
right.
Yeah.